You've already noticed that something quietly stopped working the way it used to. Not dramatically, not with a collapse, just a pause that didn't make sense at first. For a while it felt like momentum softened, not lost, just unreachable in the old way. And the strange part is, you didn't panic like you thought you would. You observed it, almost neutrally. That's not accidental. This isn't about money in the way people usually talk about it. It's about a pattern you recognized before you had language for it. A moment where effort stopped translating into movement, where pushing felt oddly irrelevant, where trying harder didn't feel wrong, just unnecessary. And even if you couldn't explain why, you knew something else was happening underneath. There's a reason this feels relevant now, not because something external changed, but because your relationship to time, value, and identity has been shifting quietly for longer than you realized. At first, it showed up as stillness, a strange waiting period with no clear instructions, a neutrality that didn't feel like giving up, just watching. You may have caught yourself thinking, I'm not blocked, but I'm not moving either. That space between, not loss, not progress, just suspension. And what made it unsettling wasn't the pause itself. It was that the old explanations didn't fit anymore. You weren't afraid, you weren't lazy, you weren't broken. You were simply no longer aligned with the version of movement you used to trust. Something in you already knew that. You might remember the moment you stopped forcing it. Not consciously, just a subtle release. You still cared, but not with urgency. You still wanted expansion, but not at the cost of distortion. That's when the silence began to feel intentional, not imposed. Chosen without choosing. Around this point, many people try to fix the pause, but you didn't rush to correct it. You sensed that interfering would actually delay something, and that instinct was accurate. There's a phase that appears right before expansion, but it doesn't look like growth. It looks like nothing responding, like reflection paused mid-sentence, like the mirror refusing to echo outdated signals. This isn't punishment. It's recalibration, not of circumstances, of identity. When identity shifts faster than external systems can respond, reality creates a gap, not to stop you, to let the old signal fade cleanly. That's why nothing broke. It just stopped cooperating. The field you were interacting with didn't reject you. It simply stopped recognizing the previous version of you as the source, and you felt that, subtly, as a kind of emotional neutrality around outcomes that once felt charged. You may have noticed that fear didn't spike, frustration didn't escalate. Instead, there was observation. That's the tell. What's interesting is that this phase only feels confusing until you realize it's not the beginning of something, it's the ending of something that already completed internally. And that recognition tends to arrive later, not sooner. Every 60-90 seconds, something inside you recalibrates. You might feel it now, as a soft settling. Not clarity, not certainty, just a quieter internal alignment. Here's what most people miss. Money doesn't freeze because of lack. It freezes when translation breaks down, when the version of you sending the signal no longer exists, but the environment hasn't updated yet. So the system pauses, not as resistance, as neutrality. You weren't being tested. You were being unhooked from an old identity loop. That's why hustling suddenly felt hollow, why strategies felt performative, why motivation language stopped landing. Your awareness outgrew the frame it used to operate in, and awareness doesn't regress, it waits. During this phase, perception changes first. You may have started noticing how effort used to equal worth, how motion used to feel like safety, how stillness once triggered guilt. And now, stillness feels clean. That alone tells you something completed. A quiet thing happens when alignment replaces effort. Time loosens, urgency dissolves. You stop measuring yourself against projections that no longer match your internal frequency, not because you gave up, but because the mirror stopped reflecting the old image. This is where many misread the pause as failure, but failure comes with emotional charge. This came with space, a strange neutrality that felt unfamiliar, but not wrong, almost like you were watching an old system power down gracefully. That's because you were. You didn't step off your path. The path widened and your old pace no longer made sense. Somewhere in this stillness, you may have noticed another subtle shift. Your imagination changed tone, less fantasizing, more quiet certainty without imagery, less craving outcomes, more trust without narrative. That's not detachment, that's identity consolidation. When the self stabilizes internally, external reflection temporarily suspends because the signal is reorganizing. Think of it like this. Reality doesn't reward effort, it reflects coherence, and coherence can't be rushed. So the pause held, not to deny you expansion, but to prevent distortion during it. You might recall moments where you almost forced movement again, applied pressure, considered reverting, and then didn't. Something in you knew that restarting the old engine would contaminate what was forming. That instinct matters because it tells us this wasn't conscious strategy, it was alignment. There's a layer to this pause that becomes visible later, when movement resumes in a way that no longer feels like effort at all. But that recognition tends to arrive only after the system updates. During this phase, people often experience a strange redefinition of value. Not money value, self-value. What you offer no longer feels transactional. Your presence no longer feels tied to output. You begin to sense that worth is inherent, not produced. That's destabilizing at first, because the old world runs on exchange, but awareness runs on resonance, and resonance doesn't negotiate, it aligns. You may have noticed that certain opportunities stopped appearing, not because you weren't worthy, but because they belonged to a version of you that already dissolved. Parallel paths quietly closed, not as loss, as pruning. This happens collectively, by the way. Many people are experiencing quiet pauses that don't fit traditional narratives. Not collapse, not breakthrough, just reorientation, a collective identity shift that doesn't announce itself. That's why this feels oddly personal and oddly shared. What feels like waiting is often just timing, adjusting to a new internal reference point. At some point, you stopped asking, when will it move again? And started feeling, it will, but not like before. That's a threshold, the moment where desire releases control and becomes readiness. And readiness doesn't rush, it listens. This is where the idea of parallel realities begins to feel less conceptual and more intimate, not as a theory, as lived experience. You sensed multiple versions of yourself overlapping and felt one quietly take precedence. Not louder, just more stable. The pause allowed that version to fully anchor, without interference, without compromise. You might notice now or later that the version of you waiting is calmer than the one who used to push. Just notice that. Eventually, and this part unfolds gently, movement returns, but it doesn't feel like restarting. It feels like continuation from a different layer. Money flows again, but without charge. Opportunities appear, but without strain. Action resumes, but without urgency. And you realize the pause wasn't failure. It was fidelity to a self that hadn't fully arrived yet. There's a clarity that emerges only after the pause, when you see how perfectly timed the stillness was. That clarity doesn't rush to explain itself. It simply integrates. As this awareness settles, you may find yourself less interested in chasing, more interested in alignment, less focused on proving, more attuned to coherence. That's not spiritual growth, that's perceptual maturity. Nothing delayed you, it protected the integrity of what you were becoming. You might feel this video doesn't end, it just loosens something, like a knot you forgot you were holding. And as the silence continues, you may notice movement beginning at the edges. Not loud, not dramatic, just inevitable. If at any point this recognition wants to deepen, not as information, but as familiarity, you may find that Parallel Realities feels less like a book and more like a continuation of the same internal conversation, not because you need it, but because you already recognize the space it speaks from. Notice how little convincing this required. We won't resolve this. There's nothing to conclude. The pause already did its work, and whatever expands next will do so without announcement. You'll recognize it, not by effort, but by how natural it feels when it arrives. There's something subtle that happens after the pause has been accepted, not understood, accepted. The moment you stop checking whether it should already be over, that's when the field changes tone. You may not have noticed it consciously, but your body did. Your nervous system stopped bracing. Your thoughts lost their edge. The waiting stopped feeling like waiting. It became neutral time, and neutral time is never empty. It's where identity reorganizes without resistance. Before, money felt like motion. Now it feels like response. Before, action felt necessary. Now it feels optional. Not because you don't care, but because caring no longer requires strain. This is where many people misinterpret what's happening. From the outside, it looks like nothing is moving. From the inside, something fundamental has already shifted position. You're no longer trying to become someone who can receive more. You already crossed that threshold. The system just hasn't mirrored it yet. And that delay isn't an error. It's synchronization. What arrives too fast can still belong to an old self. What waits arrives clean. You may remember how in the past, money movement came with emotion, excitement, anxiety, relief, fear of loss. Now even the idea of it feels quieter, less charged. That doesn't mean it matters less. It means it's no longer tied to your sense of safety or identity. And when something detaches from identity, reality pauses, briefly, to recalibrate how it reflects it. Because reflection follows coherence, not desire. That's why forcing motion during this phase always feels wrong. Not immoral, not exhausting, just off. Like speaking a language you no longer think in. There's a version of you that used to measure progress by evidence, numbers, feedback, confirmation. And there's another version, the one you're inhabiting now, that recognizes internal alignment before external proof. That version doesn't rush mirrors. It knows mirrors lag. Not because reality is slow, but because identity settles first. You might notice that the calm you feel now would have terrified a previous version of you. This is where expansion becomes inevitable, not because you're trying to grow, but because nothing is blocking the signal anymore. The pause removed distortion. Old motivations dissolved. Old fears lost relevance. Old identities stopped broadcasting. And when the signal clears, reality doesn't decide to respond. It simply does. We won't name what comes next. Naming fixes things in old frames. What's forming now doesn't need a frame yet. It just needs space. And that's exactly what the pause created. There's a point where the pause stops being something you're inside of and starts feeling like something behind you. Not finished, integrated. You may notice this as a lack of urgency to talk about it, a lack of need to justify what's happening, a quiet confidence that doesn't ask for confirmation. That's not indifference, that's coherence settling. When coherence settles, reality doesn't rush to impress you. It reorganizes itself silently. That's why nothing dramatic announced the shift. No signal, no breakthrough moment, just a subtle sense that the old pressure never came back. And that absence is meaningful. Because pressure only exists when identity is misaligned with its own direction. You're no longer negotiating with the field, you're resonating with it. When something no longer needs effort, it's usually because it no longer needs permission. You might remember how before you tried to figure out money, what it meant, what it said about you, what would happen if it stopped. Now those questions feel distant, not resolved, irrelevant. That's not detachment from life. That's detachment from the version of yourself that needed answers to feel safe. Safety moved inward. And when safety moves inward, the outer world pauses briefly, just long enough to catch up. This is where expansion stops feeling like a goal and starts feeling like an echo. Not something you chase, something that returns. You may notice that ideas arrive without tension now. Opportunities cross your awareness without excitement spikes. Choices feel cleaner, fewer internal arguments. That's not stagnation, that's signal clarity. There's a misconception that growth always feels like motion, but real transitions often feel like nothing happening because the movement occurred at a level you don't narrate. Identity shifted, perception recalibrated, expectation released. What's left is space, and space always fills itself, but only after it's no longer being controlled. What feels uneventful from the outside can be complete on the inside. You might notice that when you imagine the future now, it doesn't feel sharp. No pressure to define it, no need to visualize it vividly. Just a quiet knowing that it will be adequate, aligned, sufficient. That's not settling, that's trust without drama. And trust without drama is one of the clearest signals that the old survival-based loop ended. At some point, you may realize something else. You didn't lose momentum. You lost friction. And friction was never power. It was resistance mistaken for effort. The pause removed that confusion. Nothing here needs to resolve. Nothing needs to conclude. The system already did what it needed to do. What comes next won't feel like a restart. It won't feel like compensation. It won't feel like finally. It will feel normal. And that's how you'll know it belongs to you now, not to who you used to be. There's a moment when you realize the pause didn't ask anything from you. No lesson, no correction, no demand. It simply waited for you to stop reaching for an older version of yourself. And once that reaching ended, the pause lost its purpose. Not suddenly, quietly. You might sense this now as a gentle disinterest in proving where you are. You don't need to label it. You don't need to announce it. You don't even need to understand it fully. It's already integrated. That's why talking about what happened feels unnecessary. Because nothing happened. Something completed. Completion often feels like nothing, because it doesn't create tension. There's a subtle dignity that emerges after this phase. Not confidence, not pride, just self-respect without effort. You no longer negotiate your value internally. You no longer monitor whether you're on track. You no longer scan for signs that you're allowed to move forward. That permission was internal, and it's already been granted. The external world simply hasn't finished mirroring it yet, and that's fine. Mirrors always lag behind awareness. You may notice that you're no longer asking life to reassure you. You're listening instead, not for answers or for resonance. And resonance doesn't speak loudly. It feels like recognition, like a quiet yes that doesn't need explanation. There's also less storytelling now, fewer narratives about struggle, fewer mental rehearsals, less anticipation, not because nothing matters, but because you're no longer trying to predict alignment. You're allowing it. When identity stabilizes, the future stops needing rehearsal. Money, in this state, becomes neutral again, not charged with meaning, not loaded with survival, not symbolic, just responsive. And responsiveness only appears once pressure dissolves. That's why the pause had to happen before expansion. Because expansion amplifies whatever signal is present, and the old signal wasn't clean anymore. You may feel a quiet sense of inevitability now. Not expectation, not certainty, just inevitability. As if whatever comes next doesn't require effort, only timing. And timing, unlike force, cannot be rushed. Nothing here is meant to convince you. If this resonates, it's because you already lived it. If it doesn't, it will later, or it won't at all. Both are fine. Awareness never argues. We'll keep this open, because what's unfolding now doesn't benefit from closure. It benefits from space, and you already know how to hold that. At some point, the pause stops being noticeable, not because it ended, but because it blended into normal life. You're not tracking it anymore. You're not waiting for confirmation. You're not checking whether it worked. That's usually when things begin to move again. Not forward, not upward, just into place. You might notice small shifts first. Conversations that feel easier, decisions that take less energy, choices that don't require internal debate. Nothing announces itself as expansion. It just feels compatible. That's how alignment shows up when it's real. What fits doesn't need momentum. It needs permission. Money during this phase doesn't rush back. It re-enters quietly, through timing that feels unforced, through openings that don't demand performance, through pathways that don't require you to be smaller or louder than you are. You may notice that when it moves, it doesn't pull attention, it doesn't spike emotion, it doesn't create stories, it just functions. And that neutrality is the signal, because when something stops defining you, it can finally serve you. There's also less internal negotiation now. You're not convincing yourself you're ready. You're not arguing against doubt. You're not rehearsing confidence. You simply notice that you're already standing in a different place. Not better, not higher, just more accurate. Accuracy often feels quieter than ambition. You may realize that the old urgency hasn't returned, and that realization doesn't scare you, because urgency belonged to a self that needed outcomes to feel real. This version of you doesn't need proof to trust its own position. It already knows where it's standing. Sometimes this is where people expect fireworks. But fireworks are for transitions driven by force. This one was driven by coherence. So the movement is subtle, like a door that was always open. You just weren't facing it before. There's a calm inevitability here. Not destiny, not guarantee, Just the sense that nothing is resisting anymore. And when resistance leaves, life doesn't hesitate. It responds. We won't follow that response all the way. That would turn this into a story with an ending. And what's happening now doesn't end. It continues. There's nothing left to figure out here. That's not dismissal. That's relief. You may notice a softness now, not emotional, but perceptual, like the edges of things aren't as sharp as they used to be. Time feels wider, choices feel simpler, silence feels companionable instead of empty. This isn't a peak moment, it's a settling. You might realize that you're no longer asking life to show you what's next. You're allowing it to show up when it's aligned enough to feel ordinary, because whatever comes now doesn't need to impress you. It just needs to fit, and fitting feels different than arriving. When something belongs, it doesn't announce itself. There's a quiet belonging that emerges here, not to a group, not to an idea, to yourself. You're no longer chasing a version of you who has it together. You're already inhabiting the version who doesn't need that story anymore. And from here, reflection changes tone. Money doesn't symbolize progress. Progress doesn't prove worth. Worth doesn't fluctuate. It stabilizes. If you sit with this long enough, you may notice how little effort this recognition required. No convincing, no persuasion, no explanation, just familiarity. Like remembering a room you've been in before. Some people encounter this awareness through books, conversations, or quiet moments that don't announce themselves. If parallel realities ever crosses your path, it won't feel like new material. It will feel like the same recognition, expressed from a slightly different angle. Nothing more. Notice how complete this feels, without needing resolution. We'll leave it here, not because there's nothing else, but because whatever unfolds next doesn't need narration. It will meet you where you already are, and when it does, it won't feel like change. It will feel like continuity, like something that was always on its way, waiting for you to stop reaching for what you already passed.